Alright guys, well today I'm going to show you kind of how I set up my Centerpin. Now it's a Blood Run Centerpin rod, retails for about $150 to $200. I really like this rod. You can get replaceable tip sections, which I've broken this tip section a few times, and you can get on there and just order a new tip section. It's really nice. This is a 6 to 10 pound, so pretty light rod, really fun steelhead rod. 13 foot long. So you can get those nice mends. You can stay really tight to your float. And I'll do a casting video because I know that's been requested. So I'll do a casting video at some point and we'll talk more about the setup. But I'm going to do kind of how I run my line on here and my float setup. So it really depends on the water and the conditions I'm fishing. If I'm trying to catch bigger fish, I'm fishing a lot of higher water, I'll run like 15-pound main line on here, and I run monofilament. This is like some cheaper monofilament on here. I don't even know what brand it is right now. That's why we're putting new mono on it right now. So that's 15-pound, and then I've got like your traditional slip float setup, like a 3/8 or a 1/2 ounce, your clear drift float setup on there. So what I'm going to do, that's kind of how I was fishing. We had a high water coho. I was fishing that with beads. But now it's supposed to clear up a little bit and the rivers are going to drop down and I'm going to be starting to target steelhead. So I'm going to switch my setup around a little bit and show you what I do. So I'm going to start out by cutting off this float and taking all of this line off of my reel. Alright, so what I did is I took my line off my reel, but I left on a little bit. So the thing with a Centerpin reel, especially a bigger one, this is like a 5 1/8 inch Centerpin reel. And now, they started out with like really small reels, like 3-inch, 4-inch reels. A lot of us, especially in the Pacific Northwest, use these bigger reels because you get faster pickup on them. But with this reel being so big, it'll actually hold like 500 yards of line, and I'm never going to need that. So what I do is I'll put backing on there. So I'll either use old braided line or old monofilament. In this case, I'm leaving mono on there. And I fill it up about maybe a little over a quarter of the way and closer to halfway full with just whatever, cheap monofilament, old braided line, whatever, because you really don't need that much line on here. If I were to fill this whole spool up, like I said, it'd take like 500 yards, and you really only need about 150 yards when you're fishing. If a fish takes you on a longer run than that, you're doing something wrong, and I'm never going to get to the bottom. Like when I get to the bottom of that, it's time to change my line out. So I do that, do about, I don't know, a quarter to half of my spool filled up with just filler line. Okay, so I'm going to clip this. So then from there, I'm going to put my fresh line on. So now we're going into steelhead season. I'm going to be fishing with this setup. I'm going to be fishing smaller creeks, smaller hatchery creeks, where the fish, you will catch some bigger fish. There is some teeny size fish coming out early, but most of the fish are going to be little like 6 to 10 pound hatchery fish. And you're going to be fishing around a lot of other people. The fish are going to be pressured, right? When they first come in, they're not going to be, but when they've been sitting in these hatchery holes, the fish will get pressured. So I like to go with lighter line. So this right here is Berkeley Trilene, and I know this is pretty cheap. If you want to go more expensive or higher quality mono, you can. But this is a very inexpensive, just Berkeley Trilene. I think this is like $6 for 300 yards of it. So if you wanted to, you could put all 300 yards on here. But because I left that spool almost halfway full, I'll probably use about 150 or 200 of this. So I could actually spool my reel up twice with one of these if I wanted to. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that filler line here. I'm going to take the spool, which this is 10 pound. So when I'm fishing those hatchery rivers, I know it's going to be smaller, low clear water, I'll go down to this 10 pound. Usually I like to stick between 10 and 12 for steelhead, and then like if I'm going around salmon, I would do like 15 or 20 pound, which I had 15 on there for coho season. So this is 10 pound, very, very thin, very smooth stuff. This line actually is pretty good. I actually like it for the center pin. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna tie these two lines together. Now the knot I use, I don't even know what it's called, so I'm not even gonna show you. You guys can look up connection knots out there. But in reality, I should never hook a fish and actually get to this knot, so it doesn't have to be a strong knot. All it is just hooking it together so that I can reel this onto my reel. And I should never actually fish and get down to this line. So I'm gonna tie these together and then I'll begin to spool. All right, so now after 20 minutes of reeling line and a cramping hand, I got my line on there. Now I go about halfway up, depending on your reel, about halfway up on these holes. Now a lot of center pins will have this porting and have, you know, the holes in there. And what it actually does is, one, it makes the reel lighter when you have more porting. And number two is it allows that line to dry out. So a lot of times what would happen if you didn't have those, what would happen is your line would be wet from fishing, right? And then you reel it all on there and it would never dry out. So with those holes there, it allows it to dry out really fast and get a little bit longer life out of your line. And then also, like I said, it reduces weight when you have more porting on your reel. So I went up about halfway on those holes there. Again, you kind of have to play it by whatever reel you have. But I ended up putting about probably 200 yards of this 10 pound on there. And that'll last me quite a while. So I should be good throughout the steelhead season. As we get into later steelhead season, if I'm going to be going to a river with, you know, I know I'm going to be targeting bigger wild steelhead, I might take this line off of there and I might put 15 back on there. But this line, pretty cheap, like I said, like $6 or something. So the line's pretty cheap. It's just a pain in the butt to switch it out, but I do it usually a couple times a year, just depending on conditions. So now we're going to get into my setup here. So this is my lower clear water, my shallower setup, summertime setup as well. But winter steelhead too, when these rivers are kind of running lower or you're fishing a smaller river, right? Depends on the river. But where I'm going to be fishing a lot of, like, you know, anywhere from a foot to like maybe like 6 feet of water. The issue with running the setup I'm going to show you is it's harder to cast when you're trying to fish deeper water, and it's harder to get your weight right when you have that deeper water and faster current. But for like that choppy, like 1 to 2 foot riffle that the steelhead will sit in, that's a really good setup. And then for those like, you know, 4 to maybe 6 foot nice, you know, flat runs where the steelhead are going to be sitting in, where there's not a lot of just like upwelling and swirling, but those nice runs, this setup will work really well too. So a lot of that steelheady water, this setup works very good. And what I'm going to do is take my line. Hopefully you can see. I know that's why I don't make a lot of these videos, because they're hard to film, to be honest. So there's my main line coming off of that reel, right? I ran it through the eyes on my rod. That's important. What I'm going to do is I'm going to grab a fixed float. I love fishing a fixed float. And one of the reasons is it's super stealthy. And that's the main reason. When the water gets lower and clearer, when there's hatchery fish that have been beat on, that have seen all these floats go by, seen a bunch of beads and everything else, these fixed floats are really, really stealthy. So you can use anything from, here's like the addicted ones, right? The addicted fixed floats, which are a pre-weighted float, right? That have weight in them and a weighting system on them. So you really don't have to add much weight to them. You can just put like a jig underneath of them, right? I can grab like a steelhead jig, fish that underneath of those, or I can add a bead under there with like 1 or 2 split shot. But you don't really need to add a lot of weight. You can just tie, you know, a jig or a little bead with a couple split shot under them and you're good to go. But what I like to do is use these balsa unweighted floats, right? They're just a balsa float. They don't have a weight system like the addicted ones. They're just a simple float. This one is a Nova Tackle float. I got this off of the Steelhead Stalkers website. This one is a 1/4 ounce or 7 gram. The issue when you get to a lot of these like Midwest style floats is a lot of them are in grams. So like this one is 11 grams. This one, I like to do on these ones, they would say the grams and what ounce it would be. So this says 7 grams or 1/4 of an ounce. So what that means is that this float can handle and will fish properly at 1/4 ounce. Okay, this one is an 11 gram float, so it's going to sit right and it's going to fish properly with 11 grams of weight under it, which is about 3/8 of an ounce, right? And those are my two sizes I fish a lot for the fixed float. The 1/4 ounce or 7 grams, somewhere around there, like 6, 7, 8 grams, and then 11 grams or like a 3/8 ounce, somewhere in like the 10, 11, 12 gram range, right? Those are kind of my two all-around floats. I do have some bigger ones, but at that point, when I'm going over that like 11 gram or that 3/8 of an ounce, at that point, I'll just go to a sliding float, because usually at that I'm fishing deeper, heavier water. The fish are probably not going to really be scared of the float anyway, so that's when I'll go to, you know, your sliding simple float. But for these, you know, those runs like I was talking about, the water I was telling you about, right, the fixed float is going to be very, very good. Now, if I'm like fishing a tiny creek, super low and clear, barely any flow, I'll go more towards the 7 gram. If it's a little bit deeper, a little bit more flow, I'll go to the 11. And really, it just depends. A lot of times I'm setting up as I'm fishing. And so I'll go down to the river and I'm be like, okay, well, if I look at the forecast, it's not going to rain this, you know, for the next week, and the rivers are going to drop. So I'll tie on this 1/4 ounce. I get there and I cast that out. I might be like, it's not fishing right. It doesn't, my bait, I don't think is getting down there. And really pay attention to how that's fishing and go, yeah, I might need some more weight, so I'm going to go with a bigger float. Or sometimes I go to the river and I got my fixed float set up. I get there, cast it out there, and I go, yeah, this isn't going to work today. I'm going to go ahead and just rig up a slip float, which I actually did that the other day. That setup that was on here that I cut off, I did that. I walked down to the river with one of these set up. I started making some casts, and I was like, yeah, my float's just going too fast. I don't have enough weight. I'm not getting down there with the fixed float setups. So cut it off and slide that slip float setup on there. And so it really depends on how it fishes. And a lot of time it just takes experience, right? Just experience of catching fish and remembering like, oh yeah, when the river looked like this last time, I was using this and I caught a fish. So that is probably what I should do again. Now that's not always true, and it just takes time and years of experience and really learning how to read your float, how to read the water, and really understand how your bait is fishing underwater, because we really don't know much, right? Most of us just go out there, we rig up the float setup that, you know, Dick did or that we saw somebody else show us how to do. We cast it out there, we float it down the river, we didn't catch anything, and we go home and we're like, man, we didn't catch anything. But if you would have paid attention and really known what was going on with that gear underwater, you may have known that all day long you were fishing way too light of setup and your bait was never down there. Which is another thing too, when you're fishing these hatchery holes, there always seems to be 1 or 2 guys, you know, maybe a few more depending on how many guys, right? But you might be on a bank with 10 guys and there's always 1 or 2 of them that seem to be hooking all the fish. Now, sometimes that's because where they're standing, right? They might just be in the spot in that run where the fish are holding. But a lot of times, it's because they have their gear set up right, and they don't even know it. Most of the time, these guys won't even know. They're just like, well, I just have this set up. It's a 3/8 ounce bobber with a 1/2 ounce weight on it. And that's going to make their gear do something different than you being like, well, I have a 1/2 ounce bobber with a 1/2 ounce weight on it. All right, I'm giving away some secrets here. So I know a lot of you might not listen through this video, but if you do, I'm giving away a few secrets. So anyway, take what I just said and really pay attention there. But we're going to get into how I set up this fixed float. All right, so what I'm going to do It's based on how I think the rivers are going to be fishing when I'm going to go out in a day or two. I'm going to rig up this 11 gram fixed float. Okay, so let's see here. How I'm going to do that is I'm going to take this line and this one here, how these set up, and most fixed floats are set up by either like some kind of rubber band or like, you know, some kind of tubing system that slides over the top of the float. Okay, so I'm going to take, if I can find what I did with it, got all my gear laying out here. I'm going to take these little tubings here for this one, and I'm going to slide them up my line. So there should be 2 of them. And some of these come and you got to kind of cut them how you wish. So there's one, that's going to be my top. There's 2, that will be my bottom. And I like to do a little bit longer for the bottom one. Don't ask me why. So then I'm going to kind of set that there. So both of those tubes are on my line. I'm going to get this float a little lubed up. You can dip it in the river, dip it in a cup of water. I always just spit on it. Just don't tell the wife because she might not kiss you for a while. So spit on it and lube it up. You want to make sure you lube that up, because if you just start setting this up and sliding this float around without any kind of lubrication or water or anything, it's going to just tear right through these bands. It'll burn them up. So usually I spit on that line and you can see it slides much easier. And I just slide that up out of my way. Okay, so that's up, it's gone out of my way. So now I'm going to take a swivel, okay? And this is the way I do it. It's not the way you have to do it. And I've seen other people do it a lot of different ways. But I'm going to take a swivel, just a little barrel swivel here, right? We've all known. And I like to use, this is like a size probably 8, something like that. I like to use smaller ones. I don't have any small ones right now because I'm out. But I like to use a size 10 or 12, ideally. That's probably a 7. But yeah, I like to use like a size 10 to 12 little barrel swivel, right? And that is how later on we're going to connect a leader to our bait. But for now, you should have the float on those bands, and then down below, tie that swivel. So now, if I would just try to cast this out here, it's not going to go very far. This float weighs by itself absolutely nothing. It's just a piece of wood. It's like a little stick. You're not going to get it out there very far. And if you do, it's going to lay like this on the water, right? Here's a little fishy down there. It's going to lay like this on top of the water, right? And your bait's going to be who knows where. So we have to balance that out. Now, earlier when I said, you know, the grams or the weight, right? This is 11 grams. So I've got to balance this float out. And how I do that is with split shot. Okay, so I'm going to take my box here. This is my little box I carry with me. And I label, they're just little like flip up tabs. And I just label my split shot. So I have different sizes of shot in there. And I'll label it like what size they are. So what I use is I just used a cheap water gremlin split shot, or like the cheap split shot you get at Walmart or any kind of tackle store, right? The cheapest little split shot, that's what I get. Okay. So another thing is at least for me personally, I get the ones without the ears on them. So they're not the removable ones. Okay. What happens with the removable ones, I'll try to find one here because I have a random one in here that I probably stole from a buddy on the river because I was too lazy to get into my own box and he probably had one in his pocket or something. Okay, so this is what I'm talking about. Hopefully that will focus in a little bit. Okay, with the little ears on them, you know, the little removable ones, right? They have the little things you pinch and it opens up. I don't use those because what happens is those little ears that stick off of there, okay, they will create line twist and they will catch on your line and they will create tangles. So I use the smooth ones, nice round smooth split shot. that aren't going to cause any kind of line twisting or tangling around it, right? You get way less tangles with the smooth ones. Now you can't save them as easy. They do make there is some tools out there that will help take these off. There's a couple split shot removal tools that kind of clip in there and open up your split shot. Sometimes I'll use like a pair of pliers or like a little pair of scissors and try to like pry it open. I'll get to this in a minute, but when I clamp them down, I don't clamp them down super hard. I don't usually use pliers. I just finger clamp them down. And so sometimes I'm able to kind of pry them apart and get them off my line. So I use the ones, again, the smooth ones, less tangles, okay? So I'm giving away some secrets here. Some of you guys may not be paying attention to this stuff. So I'm gonna go on this line right here. I just slid my float up to a random length, okay, just for now. But I usually start up closer to my float, and I'm gonna start out with about a size 7. So I use 3 sizes of split shot mainly. Sometimes I use more, it just depends, but I'm usually using a number 7. Okay, this is just a number 7, like Water Gremlin or whatever, cheap brand of split shot. A number 7, a 3/0, which is going to be smaller than the number 7. And then if I feel like it, down there on my leaders, I'll run a BB size split shot. And then sometimes if I want to get lower than that, I'll run like a tiny micro split shot that is so hard to pinch on your line. I end up dropping 10 of them in the river before I can pinch one on. So I really hate using them. So usually the smallest I go is the BB, but I start with the number 7s. I also carry a few number 5s. Number 5s are going to be bigger than the number 7, and that's for if I really want to bulk my shot and really get that presentation down there. But to really do kind of more of a shot line, this is kind of a half-ass shot line, if you will, from the Midwest guys. Okay, this is kind of how I do it. So I will go with a number 7, and I'll pinch that on there. Okay, and it's really important to understand how much weight you have. So a number 7 is just over a gram. I actually have it written down. I'll look in a second. What I do is I write them down. I figure it out and I write it down so then I don't forget. So a number 7 is just over a gram. Okay, and remember we need 11 grams on here. So we got to stock up, right? So I go ahead and just start kind of piling these guys on here. And usually I will use number 7s till I get pretty close to the 11 gram mark. Okay, so I got 2 on there right now. Gonna go 3. And I'm just gonna keep on adding these split shot right here below my float. All right, so a little cut. I just checked my chart and I was wrong. A number 7 is actually closer to 2 grams. It's like 1.80 or something like that. So it's very close to 2 grams is a number 7. So if I start counting up, 2, 4, 6, right, 8. Okay, so with 4 number 7s, we're pretty close to 8 grams. Now I don't do the math like exactly. Obviously, if they're all 1.80 of a gram, I'm a little bit off, but I get pretty close, right? So about 4 of them right there, that's going to be close to 8 grams. Now a number 3/0 split shot is closer to a gram, okay? So the number 7s are about double this, right? So this is about almost 2 grams. These are about almost a gram. So if I do 4 of these, it's going to be 8 grams. And then that means I have 3 grams left before I hit 11, okay? Which is about perfect. Okay, so I'm going to do 4 number 7s up here under my float, okay? And what I like to do is all I did was pinch these down by my fingers, right? I didn't clamp them down with split shot, or with pliers, excuse me. All I do is clamp these on with my fingers, okay? And then I kind of slide them, and I get that line wet, into a little bit of a pattern here, kind of space them out a little bit. All right, so these things are spaced out, I don't know, maybe 2 inches apart. All right, and then, sorry, I know this is kind of tough. Then I've got my float. So my float, and then I have these number 7s kind of spaced out. All right, so now what I would do is I'll take 2 more 3/0 split shot, okay? Because remember, that's about 8 grams. We need 11. So 8 grams, 9, 10. Okay, this is my 10 grams. Okay, I'm going to pinch those on below my 7s. Okay, so that's what I got looking like. Bam, bam, bam. And then I have these 2 3/0 split shot down there, okay? And what you can do is you can kind of get them a little closer together as you go down. Really just depends. Play with that shot line. And what this does is that's going to fall differently in the water depending on how you have it set up, right? So a lot of guys will do lighter to, or heavier up by your float, lighter down here, okay? And I kind of do that, but not really, okay? Mostly number 7s and then a couple 3/0, okay? But what the goal is here is to evenly have this kind of sprawled out in the water. It's not going to be bunched up somewhere, right? All the weight's not bunched up. It's kind of evenly spread out through the water. So as this is floating down, you're trying to get more of that vertical presentation, right? Which we all think that we're getting under a slip float, okay? We all think, well, when I'm throwing my slip float out there, my bait's going to be perfectly aligned with my slip float. But here's the deal. You've got a weight like this, you got a slip float, okay? Your bobber stops up here, weight's down here. There's nothing in between except for line. What does line do in the water? It creates drag, okay? So now what happens is, since there's no weight in between and you got the current hitting that line, it starts pushing this around, right? So your bobber could be here, and these foam bobbers are not very sensitive. So this bobber could look straight up and down, and this weight can be pushed this way, and then you got a bait coming down under it, and it could be pushed the opposite way. So you really have no idea a lot of times with a slip float what in the world's going on down there. You just look at it and go, oh, it's vertical, so I'm fishing. Or it might be slanted a little bit, but that means your weight's over here and your bait's the other way, or your weight and your bait are over here. You really don't know what's going on underneath that float, which can kind of be scary, okay? And the key to steelhead fishing is getting your bait in their nose, right? Hitting them in the nose with your bait is how you get a steelhead, right? You want your bait down there in front of them. So if your bait's up here swirling around, if they're very aggressive, fresh fish, you're throwing something like a big old worm, they might come up and smash it. But if you're throwing a little bead and it's swirling around up there and they've been pressured, they're not going to come up and get that thing, okay? So I got this line going down. So what that does is that makes my line so it's not going to be, my weight down here isn't going to be wherever it wants to be. Now this is going to kind of evenly be placed throughout the water, okay? That's kind of evenly set up through the water column, okay? And the current speeds actually are faster at the top of the water and slower down near the bottom. That's why you do heavier at the top and smaller as you get down if you're going to do a shot line, because you need that heavier to get through that faster top current, and as you go down, the current speed slows down a little bit. So it keeps this more in line. And this float being that balsa float, and everything is connected to that float. It's not sliding through, right? So everything that these weights are doing, they're all going to kind of be in line, and you're going to know based on this float. If it's tipping up a little bit, you know you're going to be sitting like this. If it's tipping down, you're going downriver. These are probably dragging on the bottom, okay? And if it's like this, which is kind of more how you want it, that means your weight's going first, okay? So what I want to do is use that line to get down pretty vertical, okay? And you have to play with it. Like I said, I chose an 11 gram float today. Sometimes the 11 gram is going to be too much and you're going to be going too slow, right? You're going to be slowing yourself way down. Sometimes the steelhead like that. Sometimes, especially in a pressured area, they don't like it. They want a very natural, same exact as the current, not faster, not slower. So messing with that split shot pattern, messing with the size of your float is going to help you try to match that current speed and get everything laid out in the current exactly how it should be, okay? So then from there, now that I think I've got this dialed in, at least pretty close, I'm going to go back to the swivel, and that's where I'm going to tie on my bead. I know this is a very long video, so bear with me here. Please stay with me. So here we go. We got our bead, right? That's what's going to be presented underneath this float. So right there, that is a lured incognito bead. That's a pink, like permafrost bead. So it's a pink, killer pink color with a little bit of white in there. It's really, really good bead, okay? We're not going to talk about necessarily beads and rigging right now. We're just going to say we got our bead on a leader, okay? Your monos are going to break a lot stronger than a fluorocarbon. So this is a 10-pound mono, like I said, and a lot of times that 10-pound is really going to break at more of like a 12 or even a 15-pound in those monofilaments, right? Versus a fluorocarbon like this is P-Line Tactical 10-pound. It's going to break at 10 pounds, maybe even a little bit below 10 pounds. And if I get one little nick in it, it's going to go pop at about 4 pounds, okay? And that's from experience fishing it. I know this stuff. I know when it's going to break, okay? So I'll run either 10-pound or 8-pound of this tactical fluorocarbon because I know it's always going to break over this 10-pound monofilament, okay? Because it's a thicker diameter, much more durable line than this very thin fluorocarbon, okay? So I always want to make sure that I'm not going to break off and lose my float and lose all my rigging and split shot because it's a pain in the butt to rig, right? We just rigged it up. So I'm going to take this bead, which is on a lighter setup, right? Lighter leader. And I'm going to go about 2 feet-ish of leader. Sorry, this bead's hooking me everywhere. I'm going to go about 2 feet-ish of leader. And I'm going to tie this to my swivel. Now that might even be long. Sometimes I'll go down to a foot, okay? The longer this leader gets and gets away from the shot line, the less control that bead you have over that bead, okay? The longer leader means this bead could be up at the top of the water column while your split shot are down there. So if that leader is too long, sometimes that's a bad thing because then that bead's not gonna be down there in your face. But if I have it too short, sometimes all this shot will scare those fish. So you kind of got to find a happy medium. I go about 2 feet, okay? About 2-ish feet. And then I tie my knot. I got to cut some of this off. So I always tie my leaders long, okay? And I know it wastes fluorocarbon, and fluorocarbon is on the more expensive side. But when I tie my leaders, I'm always tying them like 4 to 6 feet long. And then I'm cutting them down because I don't know if I'm going to be fishing this kind of rig or a slip rig or what I'm going to be doing. So I always want those leaders long, not flossing, okay? That wasn't an option, but just depending on my float setup, sometimes I want those longer leaders, sometimes I want a shorter leader, okay? So I'm just going to tie my fisherman's knot here. And I have scissors here, so I might as well use them, right? Use them before you break your teeth. Okay, so I've got my shot line, that swivel, and then I've got about 2 foot down to my bead. All right, now what my goal is going to be is I want the shot line coming down, ideally to come down right over the bottom, okay? So say I'm fishing about 3 feet of water. I'm going to put this at about little over 2.5 feet, okay? Where I get this thing about 6 inches, so about 2.5 feet is where I want to put this bobber above this swivel, Okay, so 2.5 feet. So say I'm fishing 3 feet of water. I'm going to put that at 2.5 feet. And I'm going to adjust this shot accordingly, kind of spread it out now that I'm a little deeper. And what I want is I want this shot to be right above the bottom. Okay, so here's the bottom. I want this shot line to go down above the bottom. Okay, so that shot line is what's keeping my bead down near the bottom, because I want that shot down right above the bottom. And then this bead, right now I have no split shot on it. And when I run no split shot, it's going to give this bead a lot of movement down there and a lot of freedom. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to throw out there and I'm going to just put a little bit of tension on this float. I'm going to see how that float's fishing. And ideally it should be sitting around that water mark, and it should be sitting straight up and down, okay, if I weighted it correctly. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to tilt it upstream back at me, and it's going to kick this shot, and just slightly, you guys. It's not like this. It's like, I mean, just a barely, little bit of tilt. And a lot of times just having line on the water, you don't even have to put pressure, but just having line laying on the water will get that to kind of kick back just enough. And what that's going to do is now I'm slowing my float down, and it's tilting this shot line a little bit, and this shot line is going to go slower than this bead. So I'm holding back a little bit, and the shot line almost looks like that right above the bottom, right? So the bottom of the camera screen is the bottom of the river, right? So now I got the shot line kind of doing one of these down there along the bottom of the river, and this bead, because it's lighter, is going to kick out in front. So I'm a steelhead. Here comes the shot, and the bead is kicking out in front. Eat the bead before the split shot ever gets to me. Okay, hopefully you guys kind of get a picture of that. So a lot of people ask, why aren't you scaring the fish with all the shot? But if you're doing it right, that is the goal, is to present the bait first, then the split shot. Now, if I don't feel like I'm getting down there, or if there is a little bit faster current, I will add split shot to my actual leader right here above my bead. Okay, and that's when I go with my little tiny BB or even smaller split shot. And I might add 1 or 2 if I feel like that bead needs to get down there better. Okay, but most of the time I want this split shot line coming down and kind of angling like this on the bottom, and this bead coming down the river in front of it. And this bead just kind of washing around in front of it. They grab the bead, and with this slip float, it's so sensitive. If anything touches this thing, and I've done this, sadly, the reason I know this is because I've seen fish swallow baits and die with a slip float and not with a fixed float. And I'm talking about trout, okay? So you could be trout fishing in a stocked pond, fishing for trout, where they stock all these trout. Try it sometime. Just run an experiment. Run a bigger slip float, okay? You won't even know that those fish have eaten that bait till it is down their stomach, okay? They have to completely get that thing down their stomach before you know that they ate it. And a lot of times it's because that weight, especially in current, and lakes obviously it's not like this, but in the current, what happened is, like I talked about earlier, your weight's here and your bait's all over the place and you don't know because your bobber's like this. Well, those fish are over here chewing on your bait and your bobber's straight up and down, and it's not going to actually pull down or pull tight till those fish pull all that line straight, okay? If that makes sense, hopefully it does. So I've had like smolt in the rivers, I've had like stalker trout at lakes completely swallow that bait, and you don't even know it until you go to reel in, or until you see that bobber twitch a little bit and you might kind of give it a pull and that fish has already swallowed it. With this setup with the fixed float, it's all direct to that float. You're keeping it tight, right? Everything's kind of tight, in line. Anything that touches that bead, that touches that weight, touches this line, registers on that balsa float. So anytime I have a little smolt peck at it, ding, 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 you're going to see it. And I've had times where this float will like dunk, dunk, and go down, and you think, it's a steelhead. Yank on the hook set, and this little smolt goes flying out of the water. Whereas on this float, which they do pull these down sometimes, I'm not saying they don't, but on this float, you would see like maybe a little bite or two, and not think anything of it. You would think a little one's pecking at it or you hit bottom, right? Whereas this thing's gonna register that much, much better. So when a big steelhead grabs it, and he's been in a hatchery hole getting pounded on, and he grabs it, and as soon as he puts this in his mouth, even though this is an incognito bead, it's soft, I can soak it in scent, okay? He puts it in his mouth, it doesn't take very long for them to realize it's fake or he doesn't want it. Sometimes I don't even think that they know it's fake, but it's more of just, taste it, I don't want it. It may be a real egg, but I don't like the taste of it, or I don't want to eat it. I just grab it, spit it out. You watch fish underwater, constantly grabbing and spitting out stuff, right? If you work in their mouth constantly, they see a leaf go by, a stick, all kinds of stuff go by, and they grab it and spit it out. Well, they can do that, and as soon as they grab that bead, that float goes down. And I've seen it a lot, especially when I'm sight fishing. And even when I'm sight fishing, I learned this a lot, sight fishing for fall Chinook, right? Early fall, not even fall, late summer, right? Like August fisheries where you have Chinook coming into tidal rivers, small little creeks, and you're sight fishing. I'll watch these Chinook eat a glob of eggs, spit it out, and you don't even know. I mean, that's how sensitive they are, because if the water's moving slow or they grab it and they're swimming with it, they can grab that bait, chew on it, spit it out, and you won't even know. So having a float like this in this setup, much more sensitive, and as soon as they touch that thing, you can get them. And I feel like I've landed way more fish and actually hooked way more fish, where a lot of times my bobber might dip, right? If I'm using one of these, it might kind of dip or bump, and that was it. And that was the fish grabbing it and spitting it out, and it was a 10-pound steelhead. Whereas this, it went down or it jerked hard, I lift up on it, and it's a fish. In one of my summer steelhead videos I just posted, right? I was fishing for summer steelhead. I was using this setup right here. That's literally what it did. I thought it was going to be a smolt, right? One of those steelhead just kind of laid over, kind of went down, and I just picked up on it, and oh, that's not a smolt. That is a steelhead. So, whereas like if I had one of these, I might have not even pulled at all because it wouldn't even have really registered that much. So having a very sensitive float like this and having a setup like this, I think can be very, very effective, and you can outfish people in areas where they're throwing one of these and not even knowing what their gear is doing underwater. Now, you can hurt yourself with this rig, and I have a lot. Sometimes it can be very difficult to actually get this thing weighted out right to where that is actually working, to where the weight is going and the bait's coming first, right? Sometimes it's so hard to dial in because you have different currents and things, and at that point it's easier just to go to a slip float. So you don't want to hurt yourself. Like I said, sometimes I get down to the river, I'll have this all set up, I might make 2 or 3 casts and just look at that float and go, you know what, I don't think that's fishing right. Whether it's true or whether it's just me being a human, I go, I don't think that's fishing right. Switch to one of these guys, my confidence goes up and I catch a fish. Now, is it just because my confidence went up and really I would have caught one on this if I would have just actually thrown it? I don't know. Could be overthinking this thing a lot. But I feel like sometimes when the fishing gets tough and you have those, smaller riffles, smaller rivers, right? Where you're fishing those like 2 and 3 foot riffles, you're fishing those 3 to 6 foot, steelhead tail outs, right? A rig like this, I think if you get it right, is going to outperform and outfish a slip float rig all day long, especially when you have pressured fish. So anyway, I know this is a long video. I don't even know. It might even be like an hour long. Nobody will probably listen to it, but if you do and you pay attention, you might pick out a few things that have really helped me outfish people on the river. And I really didn't want to give it away, but I figured that nobody would listen to it anyway. If you did listen to it, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, comment down below, and I'll make some more like this. So thanks for watching, guys. Get out there and catch a steelhead.